so much for being here. It's, yeah, pretty incredible to have people from all around the world that I know in one virtual room. So family and people I've photographed. So I don't think that's ever happened to me before. And yes, special thanks to Lori and the Philadelphia Photo Art Center for hosting tonight. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to share my screen. And then, does that work? Everybody can hear me? Okay. So because of the pandemic, I've had a lot of time at home in my studio, which I think a lot of artists have been looking at their archives and reflecting on what their practice has meant. And so I've definitely been doing that. And for this talk tonight, I decided to pull out a few images of my early work, starting when I was an undergraduate at Yale University. Because I think looking back, a lot of what I was doing then definitely informs my work today. Just to give an explanation of what Yale Photo was like then, it was basically, sometimes I call it photo boot camp. We were given a 35mm camera, 50mm lens. We weren't allowed to crop, and we were only allowed to take black and white pictures. The undergraduates, through our entire undergraduate career, the color was reserved for graduate students. The people that we were looking at were Bresson, Brassai, Atche, Gary Winogrand, Ouija, of course, Robert Frank, Sally Mann, Diane Arbus. And then on my own, I was looking at Leonard Freed, Gordon Parks. But just to give you an idea of who I was looking at, definitely influenced what I was photographing. And mostly I took the train down to New York City. That's where I was from. And it's where I grew up primarily there and in Colorado. And the interesting thing about the camera is it gave me a new way to see the city. So this particular picture, it was literally one of the first ones I made for Lois Connor's photo class, and it was in FAO Schwartz, and the man in the picture was picking something out of his eye. It's a single exposure, there's a mirror, and at that time, I had this unspoken dialogue with people. He knew I was there, he knew I was taking the picture, but we didn't speak with any words. So I used the camera. I mean, I think I was looking for different perspectives, places we wouldn't often look. This is, I think, probably the only picture I took in New Haven at that time. If you know New Haven, palm trees are not a thing. I think I was really interested in how people fit into their environment. This is also an FAO Schwartz, and kind of the constructed world. I also took particular delight in people when they mimicked the landscape. So definitely a lot of sculptural, without their seemingly knowing it. This one was in Central Park. And this is, these prints are all at the moment photographs that I've taken with my Fuji camera in the studio of actual prints. So I'm not sure how they're coming across, but this was on printing out paper, which is no longer available. And it was taken of a friend of mine at her sort of estate in England. I studied abroad for a period. So there was this, bizarre kind of classical painting in the background. And then these were taken in the 90s. So then contemporary with like the Boots pharmacy bag on the couch. When I was in Italy, I mentioned we looked at Diane Arbus. There was this hunchback man that I came upon, and I was wandering around the town of Cortona, and I followed him around. I would like to say that I was definitely brazen at that point in time. I mean, I didn't have a lot of fear when making pictures on the street. That was something that changed kind of quickly and unexpectedly. I mean, there was definitely a day, I can't recall exactly when, but I started to become fearful. And I think it was maybe about the fear of a confrontation. I don't know, it's just the idea of making someone's photograph without explicit consent no longer felt good to me. So I attempted to do that on the street a little bit. This is back in New York. And when I talk about my undergraduate days, I talk about this period of a rut where I kind of made pictures that I felt like I'd made before, and I wasn't really sure what I was doing. But I was definitely aware of, you know, everybody who was on the street in Soho at this time. I mean, looking back on it now, it's interesting to me because of the lack of technology, the lack of iPhones. I mean, people definitely interacted differently than they did in the, in the last decade. So I turned to my family, and this was made at my stepfather's family's mother's house. And this is his brother and kids. And every Sunday they had a family dinner. We used to go out there pretty much every Sunday for meatballs and sausages. And, it was a big deal. It was a big part of my childhood. My parents were divorced, and so my father lived in Colorado and my mom lived in New York. I was an only child, and I flew a lot back and forth by myself and talked to strangers. So this idea of intimacy and getting close to people was definitely new. And at first I kind of failed miserably at it. I put up some pictures and a photo critique, and Todd George told me that my people looked dead. And then luckily my brilliant TA at the time, who was David Hilliard, saved me because I showed him in my ginormous 8x10 negative some little microscopic detail I was really excited about. And he said, well, why don't you just go back and make pictures of those? So this started me on my path of kind of looking at people and gesture. This was my stepfather's mother. I don't know if you can tell on Zoom, but she's wearing a hologram necklace around her neck that was actually of her son who had passed away. And because it's an 8x10, it's a long exposure. So she breathed, and that's the movement in her hands. This was a photograph that I made of my stepfather and his friend who played chess regularly together. And I was really interested in the little world that they constructed. I also photographed the environments. So this is something I really didn't think about until I was preparing for this talk. Apparently I was photographing the gesture in one way and the environments around the gesture and very close up. And then I was also photographing the actual environments where these people lived. I mean, sometimes it was still out in public. This was in Mexico City when they were building a new art center and university there. And then I turned to my husband. So I'm not sure we were actually married at this time, but I became interested. I became kind of obsessed with tables. And I'm not sure that I can say exactly why. I'm very small. So on Zoom, you can't tell. I'm under 5 feet tall. And there were a couple of things going on. One, I like to be able to go where other people can. I could fit under the table quite comfortably. And also I was interested in mundane actions that were not, they weren't exactly every day. So like picking up a napkin was something that occurred, but it wasn't like you picked up your napkin every day, and it was something you kind of did in secret without people knowing about it. So for my aunt-in-law, who I think is still awake and on the call, this is her garden in London. And her husband was a sculptor. And so again, I photographed both the physical space and then my then fiance's legs in the space. This is in New York City. And this is underneath the glass table. And then these are, so these are all platinum prints. If you are seeing the texture is because they're printed on this paper. It was a Bienfang all rag paper, super delicate, super translucent. But once it comes out of the dry mount press, it'll absorb moisture and get a little bit of texture. So part of this is me figuring out how best to represent this work in a digital slideshow. So this is the last of these particular images. I put my husband's arm in the cast for this picture. And yeah, if people have questions about that, you can ask me later. That wasn't the end of doing things to him. So the next series was in between. It was a body of work that I made in graduate school. I definitely used the camera as a way to learn things about the world, or, you know, as an excuse to explore something I'm immensely curious about. So this particular image was made because I wanted to photograph the mist that settled on the field. And my MFA was done up at Bard, and so I was up there in the summers. Of course, the mist didn't come out at all. So, you know, I had this other image. And I feel like that happens, at least with me in photography, a lot.
Holly,
Yep.
why, real quick, why did you switch to color?
Oh, yes. So, as I mentioned, at Yale, I had no choice. And then I didn't go to graduate school right after undergrad. There were a few years in between. I was actually photo editing. I was assistant photo editor at Glamour magazine and worked in editorial. So I was doing a little bit of color work, a few assignments. And then when I went to graduate school, I actually went through a period of photographing in both. But I think depicting the landscape in these images, it's when I really became interested in nature as a part of the photograph. And I was interested in the dichotomy between nature being incredibly beautiful and lush and bucolic, and also the kind of danger that lingers there. I think fear and danger has definitely been a theme. I don't know that it's always relevant in the photographs or a theme for me in the photographs, but it's a theme in my personal life. You know, when I did grow up in New York City, I lived in a bedroom that was in a basement and had no windows, so I could hear all the sounds. So the ideas of basements were scary to me. In color, I don't know, the black and white wasn't articulating the landscape in that way. I had also gone to Greece and done watercolor, and I learned how to paint in color white buildings, which really opened my eyes to the world of color and how I began to see color. And then I just kind of fell in love with it. So there was a period where I did both, and it was, I mean, color is definitely problematic. And I look back at this series and I feel like, I mean, there were a few things that were problematic for me. So clothing becomes immensely problematic for me in color. Like,
I love this picture.
oh, thank you. So this is I was doing a trust fall with my husband, and making this work, I should say there were only 3 people I was photographing, myself. And that was because when I went to graduate school and they said, well, why are you photographing your husband? I said, because he's as close as I can get to myself. And then they said, well, you should photograph yourself. So I photographed the 2 of us, and then someone else I was in graduate school with who had a completely different physique. But it was interesting, like the clothing at the time, there were all these Banana Republic ads and J. Crew, and even swing dancing was, you know, fashionable. And so like, for me, it was, how do I make it not look like an ad for Banana Republic? But this was like flying, which was something I allowed him to do to me that I actually hated. So I was exploring this idea of how play still is relevant in adult relationships, and what that means, and what allowing somebody, you know, how you allow them to interact, or what you allow in a relationship. And I thought of this work, I mean, film noir definitely was factoring in, Twin Peaks. You know, I thought of it as an open-ended narrative with these kind of dreamlike scenes. So I can't exactly explain why I made every single picture. One of the things that, when I finished the series, I felt like some pictures were definitely stronger than others and really just served the series. And that was something I wanted to change. This one I'll say I made because I was the same height as the door. So the fingers and the toes are me. And when I hung on it, the door would actually swing. So, you know, it was an interesting picture to make. And this was the basement where I lived. So during graduate school, I lived in these different houses with these different, you know, kind of scary basements. So I'm going to skip ahead a couple of series. This is a body of work called Solid Ground, and it was really, it became the impetus for Barehanded, though of course I didn't know it when I started it. I made this body of work. I lived in Weehawken, New Jersey at the time, and all of these pictures were created in a like 25 by 40 foot space. That was a really banal, semi-urban backyard. But I wanted to find like this fantastical world within it. I had right before this body of work, I had traveled overseas and I had climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, which was an incredible experience in itself. And it also had within it both, kind of exhilaration, beauty, the majesty of the landscape, and danger. One of our fellow hikers actually got cerebral edema and had to be dragged down the mountain. So he was fine. But it crystallized for me that there are always both of those things at play in the natural world, and especially in Kilimanjaro. And when I came back, it was during the time of West Nile virus. Our backyards were being sprayed and were being characterized as dangerous. So I made all of these pictures in this backyard. These are all analog prints still. Some were totally spontaneous, like this was a blizzard that occurred and our neighbors built a snow tunnel after a very warm December. This was a collaborative portrait I made of myself when I was pregnant with my son and my daughter. And it was really just meant to be an homage to our two bellies. Hers was shrinking and mine was very much growing. And she was definitely, she took charge in this picture. Like the dandelions were all her. And then I had to really convince her to leave them there long enough for me to take a picture. And then this is the picture that I really cite as starting the Barehanded project for me. This picture was made, it was based on an event that occurred. So we had these raspberries and mostly the birds would eat them. And one year we decided that we would put raspberry netting on them so that we could eat them. And a wild bird got trapped in the raspberry netting. And then we just felt helpless and we couldn't figure out how to help it, and it did escape. But sometime in January, I decided I wanted to make a picture of that event. So I tried to figure out how to do that. I didn't really want to trap another wild bird. So I hired a bird and a trainer, like a film, like a film set, a film bird. And so of course the film birds came over and they acted nothing like the wild birds. And anyway, I did make this picture. I thought I'd completely failed. But it was that experience, even though it was really small, got me thinking about the natural world and how we approach it as Americans, and this idea of kind of control and danger and big agriculture. And I was determined to look for individuals who allowed a certain vulnerability when working with nature or when growing food. And I'll just say a little bit about this slide, though, because it really crystallizes how I still use psychology very much in my practice. So mostly, I have some sort of idea or intuition or an observation about the world, and then I want to go out and find images to make that relate to it. But along the way, as I gather images, often my ideas totally shift. And so what I think the project was about changes. And so this is what I've now taken to calling reframing, and becomes a completely different project. So Barehanded turned out to be a 12-year project. So that definitely happens along the way a few times. So the first person that I wanted to find was a beekeeper. And I had this image that in a beekeeper, I'd find somebody who allowed for the vulnerability, was definitely reaping a benefit, gaining sustenance in the form of honey, but was working in tandem with their environment. What I learned in researching and photographing beekeepers is that, like everything, there's a range. And there's definitely commercial beekeeping that's not as environmentally friendly as different kinds of beekeeping. There's different hives, for example. So this particular gentleman I found in New Mexico, and his name's Les, and I got connected to him because I was on a show out there, and I called him up and I said, can I come photograph? And I had no idea what he looked like. I did know he had a long white beard. And so I spent 3 days photographing with him, and his apprentice showed up one day and was retrieving the queen out of the pocket. And that's how this image got made, which I was really excited about because I was trying to make some sort of metaphorical or I mean, I use the word fantastical a lot. I'm not sure that's always the exact right word, but I didn't want an image that was just illustrative of what a beekeeper does. I wanted it to conjure up other things. So we also made this image, which was totally his idea, actually. I was pretty happy with the other one. And he said, should I put them on my face? And I said, sure. So while I was out there, I photographed at a wolf sanctuary. This woman, her name was Angel, and she was one of the wolf trainers. And I mean, I love every time I go and photograph. I mean, this project involves a lot of research, and you know, each time I go photograph, I do generally have permission. And she said, normally people just want to come and photograph the wolves. And I was really interested in the interaction. These are catfish noodlers in Oklahoma. And these are mayflies. And this was a completely spontaneous image. The mayflies, I learned later, only live for a day. And this was also a really transformative image in terms of the series, because it made me realize that the aspect of danger I had been exploring wasn't necessarily important to the series. That each person I had photographed, while, you know, you could say bees or wolves were dangerous, they were experts, and they didn't feel any kind of danger. And what I was witnessing was more of a transformation and a meditative process that I saw consistent and also incurred in many forms of agricultural work. So I made this picture in Massachusetts, where I also moved in 2008. And I call it Sienna Turkey Madonna. And I had permission to go photograph the farm. I wanted to photograph something around the turkey slaughter. However, they didn't want me to photograph the slaughter. I had read in Barbara Kingsolver's Animal Vegetable Miracle about it being a thing of beauty. So this just happened in 20 minutes. I was originally going to photograph her mother, and the turkeys freaked out, and one spread its wings and kind of whacked her mother across the neck, and Sienna stepped in, and the next thing I knew, she had these 4 turkeys. And with a tilt of her head, she, you know, at least to my eyes, transformed from this teenage girl to a form of like Madonna and child with these turkeys. And it also, as I made this work, made me reflect on kind of our cultural and visual memory and how that is at play when we interpret images. So these are in tobacco barns that are in Massachusetts. For the first couple years of the project, I photographed mostly in and around where I live in Massachusetts. This was at a sheep and wool craft fair. So some images were made spontaneously. This was completely spontaneous. This is one of the last sheep shearers who shears by hand. These are fireflies at the end of my road. This is another one of the tobacco barns. It's a pretty lengthy process. It's like an 8-month agricultural process. I should say too that actually most of those barns have been torn down. So it was a dying industry around here, or declining. They're still using the fields, mostly growing potatoes and other crops. This is compost. And this one was actually taken at a garden in the New York. I'm experimenting with some of these images, or working on a book right now is enabling me to re-examine also all the images I made for the series, and you know, figure out the edit for the book. This is actually my daughter, who is indigo dyeing in South Carolina. So around about 2013, I went down to Charleston for in the area for a long weekend, and visited many sites and began to learn about rice agriculture and a lot of the history that I had not known. And I think growing up in the North, we aren't educated about in a certain way. And I fell in love with the environment. So the pictures I'm showing you now, they're organized by location. I mean, most of these pictures were taken in the Low Country. They were taken over a period of, I don't know, 6 years. So when I do go to a place, I tend to go back again and again and again. And I build relationships in that place, and try, even though I'm not from there and I'm an outsider, to be a part of the community, to get underneath the surface level. This is compost in South Carolina. And this picture was made in Boulder Forest. And I think my friend Chad, who's in the picture, is also listening. And I met Chad. I rely on serendipity and kind of organic word of mouth ways of making photos. This is, they're drumming on the cypress knees because they're hollow. And I met Chad at this rice conference, and he had watermelon rind pickles, and he was showing them to someone else that I was talking to. And I took his number, and then I called him up, some months later, and I said, would you want to make a picture in a swamp? And he said, sure. And in fact, my wife works for the Department of Natural Resources. So he's been incredibly helpful and instrumental to me in making many of these pictures and a model. So we trekked out into the swamp. And the trees in the background, I should say, are 1,000 years old. So this particular swamp forest has never been logged. Oops. So shrimping was another activity that I tried to photograph a lot. It's also, kind of like tobacco up here. It's, you won't find South Carolina shrimp sold outside of South Carolina. Many shrimpers have retired. It was kind of like when the bees were declining and nobody knew why. If you ask them what's happening with the shrimp numbers, they can't point to an exact reason. But I also very much through all of this work wanted to portray people's passion and why they were doing what they were doing, and why many of them continued to work in a way that went against logic. And to me, it really pointed to the spirituality of what it feels and what it feels like to be out there. So as much as possible, I wanted to create that visceral feeling. So being on a shrimp boat with all the birds flying around and the dolphins following you, and sometimes you go out at night and you come back just before sunset. It's really quite an incredible thing. But it was hard to figure out how to convey that in a photograph. So this is another shrimp boat. This was one I took earlier. This is a small family farm who they process alligators during hunting season. And this is a chef foraging for lichen that he's going to use later. And this is actually in Massachusetts. So this, and then this is back on a shrimp boat. So like I said, I'm kind of playing around with how to sequence. And I put this picture in. I often went out on the shrimp boats in the pitch black, and one time I parked on the lawn and I came back and got in my car and looked up in front of me, and I saw this rope swing hanging, and kind of without thinking made the picture. And of course it definitely conjured up other associations, and like the Turkey Madonna, this is definitely a more difficult picture for beauty, but the associations we have when we see an image like this are definitely because of our country's past. And, I think that their associations and our cultural memory are something that is worth looking at and worth thinking about as hopefully we move forward. And this was a bear during which they track and monitor. So this is going to slightly segue into another project, though this is still barehanded. I received a commission to go out to Montana and make work. And I made this picture at a farm. This was in 2016. And these are workers who work at the farm. And mostly, I always said I didn't photograph vegetables because they didn't move. And I was very much interested in action. But I was really fascinated with the garlic. And they had this communal meal every day. And so I asked if they would mind being in the photograph. And so we made this picture, and it was a relatively long exposure. And one of the things, and of course, to me, it reminds me of the Last Supper. But One of the things I didn't realize, and you can't see it in Zoom and I can barely see it in my proof prints, is that on his t-shirt, it actually says "Go to hell," which is really interesting to me. So I made a few pictures in Montana in 2016, and many of them were on ranches that had been homesteaded and were still within the family. And when I was on this ranch, this is the Mannix Ranch, I learned, well, I saw these contraptions and I said, "What is that?" And they said that it was beaver slide haystacking. So I learned about beaver slide haystacking, which is a Montana invention. It's a method to put up hay. The haystacks are about 30 feet tall, and they can be anywhere from 40 to 100 feet long, depending on how many stacks are in a row. So when they stack, they make multiple stacks and push them together. So this is where I went out and I thought I was going to make a few pictures for barehanded, and I discovered a whole new project. So again, in editing the book, I'm figuring out, like, you know, where the line is, and it's not clear yet. So I photographed at a few different ranches, and some interesting things in this work. So this is actually a woman's hand in this picture. Many people think it's a man. Is, again, like the assumptions or you know, what people think of when we think of ranching in Montana. I should say that the kids, it's a family with beaver slide haystacking. It's a family endeavor. So it's often 3 generations working 12-hour days on the ranch, putting up hay. Hay is extremely precious in that it feeds the cattle all winter. These ranches aren't, they use flood irrigation. And this was on top of the haystack, which was actually really hard to move around in. And making these pictures was kind of exciting for me because I got to see new things and things that I wasn't looking at with the other work. So for example, this shadow and machinery. So all of this machinery is handmade. And at first I was not photographing it because I was thinking that with barehanded, it was very much about like the direct connection and sort of a lack of tools in a sense. But the machinery is pretty incredible, and it allows for an independence. And when we've asked some of the people who are still doing this method, you know, well, what would you lose? And it's a sense of independence, because then if you have, if you're baling, you have John Deere equipment, for example, and you have to call the John Deere tech to come fix it. The other thing that was really interesting to me in the first time I went was the way that they sculpt the land in the process. And it's like land art. So that's something that, as I've gone back repeatedly, I've been trying to photograph more. And also the role of women. So this is a 13-year-old girl. This was the first year that I went, and I didn't know them very well. And then this was the next year when I went back. And the women, or, you know, one of the ranchers told me that he prefers the teenage girls to drive the equipment because they're not as hard on it. So this gives you an idea of the scale. The haystack on the left is the previous year's haystack, and then the one on the right shows you the beaver slide and how much bigger they are. I've also been photographing in the ghost towns. This is in Bannock, which is was the original capital of Montana. And a lot of the towns were short-lived and, you know, basically around mining. This is another rancher's daughter. She's more grown now. She's going to medical school, but, and her mother is from the Philippines. So I was also looking at kind of the history and the legacy of immigration and assumptions that we have about who the population is. So one of the ranches that I photograph at, it's a half brother and sister who are in charge of the ranch now, and their mother was originally from Nicaragua, And there's a really amazing story there, which I don't have time to go into right now, but just about the history of how their mother came to the US and, ended up getting a divorce in the 1950s and moving from Salt Lake City to Montana. And so they're just really incredible stories. And I've also been trying to do research into the history of the topography, and a lot of the hay that's grown is from native grasses. So to really think about the history. I mean, certainly photographing in agricultural regions, you can't escape the violent history of the past that is often characterizes these areas in the US. So I think it's really important to research and understand that history, and then also portray what is happening now as we think about the environment and how people are working. And ultimately with this work, it's a celebration of people who I feel like have a conviction and a commitment to the land in the way that they're working. So this is the Methodist Church in Bannock. And then this is another spin-off project that came out of working in South Carolina. I'm calling it Under the Brush Arbor because these are photographed at South Carolina camp meetings. And originally there would have been no dwellings. And the brush arbor was the trees, or it was like a natural church. So first I went to the location and took a couple of pictures when the camp meetings were empty. This will just give you an idea of how they're constructed. They're generally in a kind of circular or oval or somewhat squarish shape around a central tabernacle. This is an archival shot from the air. They've had a lot of fires over the years, so they burned down, they've been rebuilt. And just a brief history for the camp meetings began during the Second Great Awakening, which was at the end of the 18th century and went through to about 1830. Camp meetings started right around 1800. And my hypothesis, and one that was I kind of found with stated in religious scholar writings, was that there was no one kind of camp meeting. So there might have been a reason for camp meetings to be started in Kentucky or Tennessee that was slightly different for the gatherings in South Carolina. But the general premise was that as people moved further west, they didn't have established churches. So itinerant ministers would preach, once a year or a couple times a year. They would travel by horseback up and down the eastern seaboard mainly, and people would gather. So in this drawing, you can see the tents in the background. So originally people would have actual tents and covered wagons. They still call the dwellings, which are wood cabins, tents today. This is from Minuet Floyd's book. She's been doing research on a project on a camp meeting she attended growing up as a child, and the other African-American camp meetings that are in North Carolina and South Carolina. This is a photograph I found. So in 2017, I gained permission to go. That was also a lengthy process. It took me a year, and while I had permission, I didn't know anyone. So this is the final Sunday where everyone gets dressed up and does sit out on the lawn and listens to the service. And the minister opened with, "We are separated not by race, but racism." And I should say that the camp meetings in South Carolina are racially separated. So there's white attended camp meetings, and then there's Black attended camp meetings. And I was really surprised to hear the sermon, and he urged, bridging divides in the community. And it was a sermon that was echoed in Stan Woodward's documentary, which had been recorded about 10 years before. And it also really clarified for me that I needed to do historical research and understand the history of camp meetings and the Methodist movement in America. So I returned to Yale last year in 2019, and that's where I did the fellowship at the Gilder Lehrman Center there to really dig into the history. so this project, both 10,000 Haystacks and Camp Meeting project have been affected by the pandemic. Camp meetings were completely canceled this year. I couldn't get back out to Montana to photograph. These are just some examples of primary sources that I'm looking at, because when I eventually present this project, it's really important to me that the history is told in the voices of these primary sources. So I've been looking at newspaper articles, letters, the bishop's journals. Within Bishop Asbury's journals, he definitely expresses anti-slavery sentiments. And that was known within the Methodist movement as, however, in the Deep South at that time, the Methodists still basically allowed camp meetings to be integrated in the sense that everybody was preached to together, but separated in separate seating, separate, if there were conversions being taken place. So they went with what the history has created. So these are archival images that I found in the local county archive. A lot of them were taken in the 50s. There's not a lot of photography of camp meetings. So they were in rural agricultural areas mainly. So I just think there weren't a lot of cameras. And I started making photographs before I found these archival images, but it is interesting to me how, there's so much is the same. There's a candy store at each camp meeting. So the other aspect that's important to know is that at the white attended camp meetings, there are predominantly African-American cooks who cook for the week. In 2018, I received a commission to photograph for Gravy, which is a journal that's created by the Southern Foodways Alliance out of the University of Mississippi. And that's what enabled me to ask permission to photograph at 4 camp meetings. So last year in 2019, I photographed at Indian Field, at Cypress, St. Paul, and Shady Grove. And St. Paul and Shady Grove are 2 of the African-American camp meetings. I was also interested in kind of the gestures that occur there. These women are actually playing a game of concentration, and these boys are playing football. But how these kind of gestures of worship, show up even when worship isn't happening at that moment in time. So these are the kitchens at Indian Field, and photographing the relationship between the people working and their employers is, definitely one that I feel I need to take time with. And again, I'm very aware of the power of the camera, and that as a photographer coming in as an outsider, that I could tell a specific story. But I'm really interested in spending the time to tell multiple stories. So that's why I look at these projects as being 5 to 10 years. So these pictures that you're seeing now are actually made over 3 years. But I go back and I photograph the same families. And when I received the commission for Gravy, it enabled me to photograph people working at one camp meeting and then cooking at their own camp meeting. So this is Ruth, who is just an amazing person and cook, and this is her family's tent. And they're very old and very dark, so it's a little bit of a challenge to photograph in some of these kitchens. This is what they're cooking on. It's called a cooking furnace, and they're really difficult to cook on. It requires a great amount of skill. This is raccoon meat, which I ate. I was also really interested in portraying the spaces where people basically bring everything in for the week, and then they bring everything out. So I'm just going to go through these quickly because of time. And these are just a few archival images that I found of the agricultural history of the community. So I'm trying to figure out how that will work into the project, or if it'll become a part of the project, photographing in St. George and Dorchester County at other times of the year. So this is sugarcane, making sugarcane syrup, which is something I actually had photographed years before. And so all of this was leading me to another new series, of which I don't really have photographs to show you because I had just begun it. And you know, I read a story in the New York Times about kind of new churches that were taking place, not in actual churches, but in other sites. And I became interested in gestures of worship and the idea that, you know, when we think about worship and the gestures, there are many that cultures and religions share. And yet when we think about ideologies and theology and certainly history, you know, many of our wars are religious. So this is a collaborative portrait. I was calling them loosely faith portraits that I made with my friend Dontavius, who I think is listening. And I met at the slave dwelling workshop. He owns something called the Chronicles of Adams, where it's a historical interpretation that he performs and creates based on primary sources and stories of the enslaved. And he tells it, and he uses within this performance these blessing dolls, which he also makes by hand. So I asked him if he would make a portrait that was about faith, and we went to this location that he had chosen, which was the first African-American church in the county near where he lives in North Carolina, on the border of North Carolina, South Carolina. So we made this picture, and then there was a pandemic. So I stopped making all of the work and made these pictures instead. So I'm just going to end really quickly with some pictures I made this summer of siblings, mostly teenage siblings. These are my two. And this was made in April. And as, you know, months of isolation went on, and I thought about, like, do I just not photograph at all? You know, do I just wait it out until I can resume making the kind of work that I wanted to make? The project about faith is something I'm really interested in, and I know I will resume, but I'm interested in faith in a bigger sense in terms of not just religious faith, but how, you know, it functions in our everyday lives, how it functions in physical acts that people do, like rock climbing and dance. But I feel like this was kind of a gift. You know, I began photographing these sibling pairs, and I started thinking about, and it kind of circles back to the beginning of the talk and this idea about intimacy and gesture. And I was thinking about intimacy. I've been thinking about how we often, I feel like in our cultural mix or confuse intimacy with sexuality, and what does that mean? I can't say that, you know, these are so new that I just put together a small selection. So I don't know where this project will go. But I did love some of what was coming out of it. And, you know, boys with hickeys and girls doing circus. And then I started seeing angels everywhere. And these are where my projects start to come together. I mean, this is more made for this idea of faith. He's a Kundalini Yoga Sikh. He lost his father. He stepped into the role, and his sister. They just happen to be siblings. So I'll just leave you with a few angels. That's it.
Thank you, Holly. That was so beautiful.
Thank you.
There's a lot to talk about. Please feel free to add some questions in the chat, or even if you want to ask a question to Holly, just please raise your hand or unmute yourself and break in. Where do we start? Okay, so the thing that I wanted to talk to you really quickly about and ask about was the the sort of like this the way you broke up the camp meeting work with the empty meeting place. I mean, I felt like you were looking at it from different angles in different ways, and it just felt so striking. But I wanted to know what they meant. What did those mean for you in that sequence?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really great question, and something that's been really challenging with the camp meetings, and something, there's so many different spaces. So there's there's everything that's happening in the kitchens. And of course, then there's like 4 different camp meetings. But even within a camp meeting, yeah, there's the space of what's happening in the kitchen and the interactions there. There's what's happening under the tabernacle. There's, certainly the times of worship, which I haven't really photographed. So finding my way through that has definitely been a challenge. And then of course I'm a photographer, right? So like I'm looking for the amazing light and the beautiful, and then there's only an hour of it. And I almost wish I could split myself in 4. So I am trying to, I guess, like categorize what I'm photographing. So definitely what's happening in the kitchen and those relationships, the kind of emptiness or the remains, so that chair or the plate. And I mean, I'm certainly happy to like pull up if anyone has a question about a specific image. I know I went quickly, but that's something else that really interests me. And then the tabernacle, I'm interested in spending more time under. So I have the one picture of the kids kind of hanging out there. And then the pictures of the actual worship or the services are kind of the most challenging because nobody, people are just sitting generally. And I did get up, and it was, I was invited to photograph from the, what do you call it? Stage, I guess, because it's a podium, like behind the preacher when I was there in 2019. And I was so uncomfortable because I just felt like, oh God, like everyone's looking. And I just thought like, I'm going to take my picture and I'm disrupting this service somehow, even though I was encouraged to do it. So, I mean, I think too, yeah, like with me as a photographer, it's also about like working with like what I'm comfortable with. So, I mean, definitely with people cooking in the first year, it was really difficult. I mean, I asked people permission, but I didn't know if they really wanted me to take their pictures. And then, I've gotten to know people and their friends. And I mean, one couple who were cook, they were a husband and wife cook, and they were the nicest to me. I took their portrait and I sent them down to her just this year, and she called me up and told me her husband had just died. So it's complicated, right? In the sense of like figuring out what I'm photographing and where, even within this complicated kind of cluttered space, has been a challenge.
Okay, so the questions are kind of rolling in now. Susan Lynton wants to ask you about your printing process. What is it about your printing process that's
that's my mother.
Oh.
Ask her about my printing, but I don't know what she wants to ask. I'm very meticulous about it. Yeah, I mean, I obsess over, right now I'm kind of going nuts with like getting a particular scan, and I've been making C prints for a long time. So I've been trying to switch to pigment prints, but still to have that same quality and depth.
How do you decide or know when a series is done, or are they never really finished?
That's another great question. Gary, I can see you asked that question. Yeah, in the early days, it was, I don't know, and maybe some of the other photographers would like relate to this on the call, but I feel like everything was very much to the exhibition. So, and exhibitions were somewhere between 10 and 20 photographs. So I feel like I had in my mind that was like a series. And then with Barehanded, it became a bit of a conundrum because what I really wanted was to be able to go to every rural region in the US and create an in-depth body of work. But at the same time, I was raising 2 children, and it became clear to me that was going to be really difficult in the sense. And it just kind of evolved, like with 10,000 Haystacks and Under the Brush Arbor with the camp meetings. At first, I was trying to figure out if they fit into this larger, never-ending body of work, and then I realized they really separated themselves. So I would say it's an involvement, of a series being done. But I will pull pictures. So, for example, the picture of the Methodist Church in 10,000 Haystacks, I feel like it could live in that series. But then in this new work that I'm making about faith, it could live in that series too. So I definitely feel like I have these, you know, watery borders that are not like, they're not clear. But I do feel like what I'm investigating in terms of how people relate to the machinery in the West, and certainly with the land and kind of more landscape, like it's different. So
Patricia asks, how much of your work is set up and spontaneous?
I would say that I strike for a balance. So like the sheep on the stand was totally spontaneous. The rope swing, as I mentioned, was totally spontaneous. Coming upon like the boat and the vines, I mean, those kinds of things are just driving around and finding them. But most of the other pictures, they're set up in the sense that people know I'm coming, you know, and I ask permission to come photograph. So, I mean, for example, well, with the camp meetings, I went through a permission process of getting permission from the trustee at each individual camp meeting to come and photograph. And then with each, you know, group of people that I photographed, I asked their permission first. But then I hope that they'll forget about me, you know, or, you know, there's spontaneity or things that happen while I'm photographing. And then the same with photographing on the ranches. I mean, there's definitely a rhythm, which I love. So my best way of photographing is to photograph something that repeats. So I love the repetitive action of work and movement. And I was a dancer when I was younger. So I think my love of movement and gesture and what is conveyed through that is, you know, comes from then. But I try to keep it spontaneous because otherwise I feel like the images fall flat.
It's 8 o'clock. And with your permission, we can go a few minutes longer.
Sure.
It's your event, really. So there's a couple questions. One's about politics, and Julie writes, did Northern politics get in the way of Southern politics when you were filming down South? Or did politics never come up into it?
Do you mean, can you clarify your question? Do you
Says,
mean
having strong political feelings, I'd find it difficult to be neutral in the midst of the Southern fundamentalism.
Well, I think one of, to me, the greatest gifts of making this work has enabled me as an individual person to travel around America and connect to people, all different people. And I can't tell you like the generosity and the openness that I've received. And most of the people, like I can see Morgan and her family's hosted me. And Erin was on the call and she hosted me. I mean, these people who just never met me before offer me their homes, their food. I mean, it's amazing. And, you know, to be honest, it's also what got me really interested in investigating Christianity in our country, because I feel like a lot of the aspects of being a good Christian and some of what we're seeing in Southern politics as well are lost by like our media and our, you know, how everything gets reduced. And so I try to go in with, I mean, of course, I have my own background and I have my own perceptions of where I came from, but I try to put my assumptions aside. And my assumptions have been challenged on many levels. And, working with people in Montana, like these families are immensely passionate about the land and about preserving the forests. And I've seen, you know, them having to go out and put out a forest fire in the morning and then put up hay in the afternoon. And their kids work 12 hours a day, which I know my kids could not do driving those tractors. So I feel like, of course, you know, even within families, there are political issues, but it's to me, I'm looking, you know, as my daughter just worked on this project, and, you know, like I'm looking to build bridges. I'm looking for communication, and I'm looking to learn in the process. So yeah, it's not easy, you know, particularly when I'm photographing racially separated communities. Like that's not easy, and I don't have answers. I only have questions. But and Dontavius, who's on this call, was instrumental to me. He gave me 2 blessing dolls, and he told me that there would be times when I would say, why am I doing this? You know, like it'd be so much easier for me just to stay in my house in Massachusetts. And he said, you just have to keep doing it. So there are people who support you along the way. And, you know, that makes a huge difference. And anyone I photograph, like they can all tell you, like I always show them the pictures. And so that to me also, like, you know, if the people I photographed are not happy with the pictures I've made of them, then you know, the pictures wouldn't be out there.
I can say, and I just want to, it's not a question. It's about what I see and why I think your work is so moving. It's because I can feel the presence of the generations. I can feel the presence of the history and the lineage and the stories that have passed through the generations. The photograph of Dante in the window frame. I just feel that it's connecting those things. So, and that's to me one of the essences of the project and the work that you do. I know that wasn't a question. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
But
I mean,
has a great question, and this might be our last question, y'all. Holly, what's something you really want to photograph but haven't gotten to yet?
Well, I mean, so, you know, with this, with the Faith Project, I had planned to photograph, for example, at Healing Springs, like these miracle springs in South Carolina that supposedly cured a Revolutionary War soldier. So I'm very interested, like in terms of this concept of faith, like I'm interested in, you know, blind faith. I'm interested in, you know, I mentioned my friend Amar Das, he lost his father. And then the very next day I let my daughter drive a car to school. He lost his father who was driving to go teach school. And the next day I let my daughter drive to school. So there's this, you know, to me, this idea of faith, and I can't even say exactly how it's going to manifest, but there are sites that I would like to get to that I can't go to right now. And even things like someone else who's on the call told me about, you know, this amazing town in Florida. So they're like, yeah, there's places I can't get to, but I feel like the gift that I've had with the work that I'm doing with siblings is it's showing me new things. And there was a point in the summer where I was kind of going to give up on it. And I pushed through, and it was actually, you know, somebody wanted me to come photograph. She's like, just come up and photograph this afternoon. And I was like, okay. And I did, and it was a great shoot. And it was the two with the, you know, the boy showed up with like these 3 hickeys on his neck. And I was like, wow. You know, like, and you know, it yeah, so there's all kinds of pictures I would like to go make right now. But I'm, you know, learning to be patient and accept the gifts that we're given. And, you know, we're all in this in a weird way together. So we'll get there.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We try to keep these to an hour to respect all of our time. And I really appreciate your questions and your comments. Next week, Ron Tarver, a Philadelphia photographer, is going to be showing his body of work, A Conversation with My Father. It's an extraordinary body of work. I'm so excited that he's going to be our next featured speaker. So please come back if you can. And thank you, Holly. It was a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. It's so nice to see your faces.